Roasting every video game controller. Most of these are pretty decent, so don't take anything to heart. We're gonna start off with the Atari 2600. This is one of the first ever controllers, which I guess is its excuse for only having one button and a joystick. It's as primitive as it gets when it comes to a controller that doesn't look like a calculator, which means criticizing it almost half a century later is kinda a waste. NES controller. It's still one of the most iconic pieces of tech ever made, even though it's literally just a rectangle with two buttons and a D-pad. This controller has been criticized for its sharp edges countless times. It's like the UK. It's fine for a few hours, until you start getting stabbed. NES Power Glove. Yeah, if you've ever watched AVGN, I don't need to explain to you why this controller is a piece of shit. It's pretty good against the final boss of Zelda 2 though. Sega Master System controller. It just looks like if you combined an NES controller with a TIE Fighter. I've never actually held one before, but that's because it's a Sega Master System controller. Super Nintendo controller. It's difficult to come up with any criticism for this, so I'll just say it looks like a bar of soap. Sega Genesis controller. It's another good controller, but I think now that it's been 30 years since the 16-bit era, we can confidently say the Super Nintendo did almost everything better than the Sega Genesis, and that's including the controller. Also, where the hell are the side buttons on this thing? No wonder they needed a 6-button version later down the line. PlayStation controller. If you really think about it, this controller is basically just an SNES controller, except the buttons are stiff and gross in comparison. It does have two extra shoulder buttons and a better grip. It's a decent controller, but it's gotta be one of the most boring ones to ever exist. Yes, I know they eventually came out with an analog version. That one's much better cosmetically and mechanically. Virtual Boy controller. Is it just me or does this thing look like a Space Invaders character? Nintendo 64 controller. Yeah, I think this one speaks for itself. Not sure what type of drugs they were on while designing this thing, but it's actually not as bad as it looks, which isn't saying very much. This controller just encapsulates everything about the 1990s into one piece of plastic. It's wacky, colorful, and looks like something I should be censoring. Listen, if you're gonna play this system nowadays, just get one of these off Amazon. Sega Saturn controller. I honestly have nothing to say about this because once again, I've never even held it. I do not own a Sega Saturn, just like everybody else. Sega Saturn 3D control pad. This thing is a circle. A circle. PlayStation 2 controller. It's an all-round improvement from the original model, and the only thing I can complain about is that it's still kinda boring looking. Also, it was probably just used as a TV remote most of the time. Xbox controller. I mean, this thing is just a monstrosity. You'd have to invent new adjectives in order to describe this thing effectively. I've never owned one of these, but if there's ever a time where I'm too happy and I need something to make me mad, I'll consider picking one of these up. Xbox controller S. Much better than the original model, but so is everything else to ever exist. GameCube controller. This thing's pretty amazing, but why the hell is there only one front shoulder button? What were they thinking? Also, even though I love this controller, I can't help but think of smelly Melee players when I look at it. Sega Dreamcast controller. This is basically Sega's version of the 64 controller. It's not as bad as it looks, but you just have to ask once again, what kind of drugs were they on when coming up with this? It looks like something that's supposed to calculate your blood pressure. Nintendo Wii controller. This has got to be the greatest bad controller of all time. It's one of those things where you're justified in loving it and justified in hating it, but I think it's funny that if you hold this thing horizontally, it's literally just an NES controller. Nintendo Wii Pro Controller. If the SNES controller was a bar of soap, what the hell do you call this? Xbox 360 controller. Literally nothing to criticize here. The only thing I can say is this controller has probably heard the most racial slurs out of any other controller. PlayStation 3 controller. Once again, the same controller as last time, but with a few well done enhancements. Still boring, but ironically, this thing is actually one of my favorite controllers, probably due to the PS3 being my childhood console. But could your average consumer even tell the difference between a PS3 controller and an analogged PS1 controller? I don't think so. Besides, I bet the only reason I find it comfortable is because my hands are the size of the amount of reasons to buy a PS5 Pro. PlayStation Move. I mean, does this even count? PlayStation 4 controller. There we go. PlayStation actually decided to innovate. The problem is I don't like it. It's got a better grip and the joysticks, triggers, and especially the D-pad all feel nice, but the build quality is awful and the touchscreen is a gimmick at best. This thing's kinda overrated. Xbox One controller. I just think it's funny that Xbox made two amazing controllers in a row after their first controller looked like this. That being said, the main four buttons are my only semi-complaint. They're more sensitive than an Undertale subreddit. Nintendo Nintendo Wii U Gamepad. Trust me, if you actually own this thing, you know it's an amazing controller. The problem is, you're a normal human being, thus, you don't have a Wii U. Nintendo Wii U Pro Controller. This controller definitely has its fans. I tend to think it's just a 360 controller, but worse in every single category imaginable. Nintendo Switch Joycons. Probably the worst durability out of any video game controller ever made, which is hilarious considering this is still the controller that comes with an ongoing console generation. I could almost forgive the bad build quality if these things didn't cost an arm and a leg each, but damn. Nintendo Switch Pro Controller. I like how this was the closest Nintendo ever got to a perfect controller, and then they decided to make the laziest D-pad ever conceived and forgot to analog the triggers. PlayStation 5 controller, one of the best controllers of all time, no doubt. Not much to make fun of, other than it being the PS5. Xbox Series X controller, they took the Xbox One controller, slightly changed the aesthetic, and gave it a new D-pad. Lame. Let me know if I missed any down in the comments. I know I missed a couple like the Magnavox Odyssey, Intellivision, TurboGrafx, 3DO, Neo Geo, but those are all rather obscure nowadays, so didn't really feel obligated to include them. And yeah, that's about it. Let me know in the comments what's your favorite video game controller. Talk to you again soon.